Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio, who's also out with a new op-ed calling on U.S. companies and lawmakers to increase domestic capital investment to keep America competitive. Senator, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So before we get into your op-ed, I just want to get your reaction to these comments from the president just a few minutes ago. This idea that the trade dispute is a little squabble, that talks have not collapsed. How do you see it?
Well, I don't think talks have collapsed. Ultimately, I do think both sides will have to talk, but I think he's doing the right thing. Look, we have no choice but to address this China imbalance that exists writ large in our relationship, but particularly when it comes to trade. We have to deal with it now. This only gets harder from here. And I give the president credit. Look, the easiest thing for him to do in the short term is leave the status quo in place or cut some fake deal, and the stock market will perform well, and in the short term we'll have good results from it. But in the long term, it continues to chip away at the underpinnings of our economy, at the structure of our economy, and will ultimately leave us in a worse place. This existing relationship between China and the U.S. on a number of issues, particularly on trade and on industry, is out of balance. And if we don't balance it and balance it soon, the long-term ramifications for our country aren't going to be harmful. They're going to be catastrophic, and they're going to be devastating.
Yeah, Senator, we've seen quite a number of administrations over the years try and address these issues, or at least some of these issues with China. Some have failed, and some have maybe made a little bit of headway in specific areas of specific industries. But looking at the situation more broadly right now, and the fact that, as you basically put it, we're at this precipice, are tariffs the right way to move forward right now? No,
ideally you wouldn't have tariffs, but I would argue that we already face tariffs. We already face all kinds of impediments to access to their marketplace. Then you add to that their subsidization of these industries that they're trying to make global champions. Then you add to that the fact that they force the transfer of intellectual property, and if they can't force you to transfer it, they steal it from you. So we already have a series of hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese penalties against the United States, which are threatening our long-term viability. We are losing our capacity as a nation to lead in the critical industries of the 21st century, and that will redefine the century. 10 or 15 years from now, this debate will be non-existent because it'll be over and they'll dominate these important fields. This is probably the last time we have to address it.
So, Senator, what if this tough tactic doesn't work? You say if we don't balance this relationship soon, it could be bad. But what if it stays this way and the tariffs have to remain in place? Will you be satisfied with that?
No, well, I think that's not the ideal outcome, but ultimately what will end up happening is the American consumer market is important enough that you're going to begin to see, and are already seeing, a number of companies decoupling from the Chinese economy, looking for other places to move their production to avoid this sort of situation. Eventually, the markets will respond to this by moving their productive capacity to places where they aren't facing these impediments. Or you're going to see it'll make it cost effective to go into the domestic production of these important goods here within the United States. Depends on the industry. But ultimately, I would love to see a world in which the U.S. and China get along and have a fair relationship. But to allow this imbalance to continue is dangerous. It's dangerous for the global peace and security. Eventually, this unbalanced relationship between the U.S. and China will lead them to take aggressive measures, both economically and potentially militarily. The U.S. will have to respond, and then we're going to have a real conflict, and a devastating one at that. We've got to bring symmetry and balance back to this relationship for the sake of global stability and peace.
Yeah, it's certainly a conversation I've had with quite a number of people in the Pentagon, this concern about what this could mean longer term over the coming decades, this dynamic between the U.S. and China. You published an op-ed today focused on this need to invest in America again. The last line, I think, of the op-ed sums it up. If we do not change our public policies to reflect long-term investment as a priority, we will not be able to compete globally or build the America our values demand. What are you proposing, and how crucial is it to take steps like this right now in the face of these trade tensions with China?
Well, first of all, we have to have a cultural realignment about short-termism versus long-term thinking. And I think that's true for government, and certainly government has not done its part in basic research investment and so forth. But I think in the private sector, it's all since beginning the 1970s, both our private sector and then our public policymakers have gravitated toward giving a presence to the immediate short-term return to shareholders, and it's come at the expense of investing in new product lines and new ideas, or in creating the capabilities here within the United States. So we're not a command and control economy like the Chinese are, and that's not what I'm advocating. I'm advocating that our public policies treat everything fairly, but incentivize things like making immediate expensing permanent, so that we create a tax incentive to say, if you do anything else with your profits, we'll treat you fairly. But if you take those profits, or a significant portion of them, and use them to reinvest, whether in adding capacity, in developing and innovating new ideas, new product lines, and so forth, we are going to incentivize that. It is important that our public policy reflect that priority, because the end product of that is the creation of strong and stable jobs, which is the cornerstone of strong communities and ultimately a strong country.
Senator, you mentioned we're not a command and control economy. All of our viewers would agree with you. But if we're going to write $30 billion checks to farmers and lean on the Fed to cut rates, does that weaken our argument?
Well, I also think there is a role for government to play in times of emergency or a significant national challenge. I think there's a difference between saying we're going to abandon the free enterprise system and make central planners at government make decisions, and having public policies that reflect our priorities. In this particular case, in which specific industries are facing a sort of transition period in which they're being badly hurt, there is an appropriate role for government to play in helping them. Now, it can't be our permanent policy forever. You would hope that that would serve as a bridge to an adjustment, and it's one of the things we haven't gotten good at. Well, I think obviously.
For how long can we afford to do that?
So agriculture is a good example of it. Agriculture faces two challenges. The first is obviously now that their products are getting hit, they're losing market access. We never want to lose our agricultural capacity. We never want to lose the ability to feed ourselves, not to mention the world. But I would say the second challenge is farm equipment and heavy machinery in the farm industry. The Chinese have made it very clear they intend to dominate the world in that field. And we have to ensure that doesn't happen, because ultimately, no matter what we grow, if we depend on them for the basic equipment necessary to farm and grow, we have a big problem too. So I don't know how long it will take. I don't think it takes forever. But what is the alternative? The alternative is to accept the status quo or some symbolic agreement that changes nothing. And the status quo with China is not just untenable, it is dangerous, it is honestly catastrophic. And we will wake up one day, not far off in the future, and realize that America is no longer the world's most important country or most important economy. And that is not something I want to be a part of.